we can go ahead and get started. Thank you for those of you that are joining us on Zoom, and we're also on Facebook Live this afternoon. So my name is Melanie Farrell, Director of Board and Leadership Development for the CMBA, and have the pleasure of working with our sections. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Environmental Law section, which our chair is Kevin Cronin. So I'm going to kick it over to him for some hellos and introduction of our speaker today.
Thank you, and welcome to Hot Topics, everyone. Here at the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association, it's a series of discussions on emerging and relevant issues. Today, we'll be talking with Angie Schmitt, a noted transportation safety author. To learn more about future events, follow CMBA on Facebook. We're pleased to announce our next forum next Tuesday, August 11th at noon, here at brought to you again by the CMBA Environment section. We will host a discussion on HB 6, last year's energy bill, that has now generated interest towards repeal or reform in wake of the state's historic bribery scandal. We'll have some state experts to talk about energy priorities for Ohio, a discussion you surely won't want to miss. Now, today's forum, I'm pleased to introduce Angie Schmitt, one of the country's best known experts on the topic of pedestrian safety. She's the author of a book, a soon to be published book that will be coming out soon called Right of Way: Race, Class, and the Silent Crisis of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And her writing and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, Atlantic, NPR, and elsewhere. She's the founder of a Cleveland-based urban planning firm, 3MPH, which specializes in pedestrian safety. She lives in Detroit Shoreway with her husband and 2 children. Angie, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was a great introduction. I'm just going to launch right into the
Please do.
Presentation. Okay. So yeah, so I recently completed this book, and it's about pedestrian safety, which is an issue that I don't think has gotten the attention it deserves. But when I tell people about this book, I always say in the US, we're having a pedestrian safety crisis right now. And this is what I'm talking about. Since in the last decade we've seen about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths. And what the book does is try to explain why that's happening, what we can do about it, and why we haven't done it already. So to get started, I'm just gonna give you a little background. And I think that hopefully this presentation will be relevant to attorneys, because I think that the way we conceptualize this problem has a lot to do with how it's handled legally and contributes to the problem in a lot of ways. So just as background, I have a historic picture here. This is Euclid Avenue near East 6th in 1930 in Cleveland. And I just want, if you just gaze at the picture and sort of take a look at it, a couple things I want you to notice. One of them is how crowded the sidewalks are. And another thing, in this time period, pedestrians pretty much had free roam over the streets. There weren't crosswalks at this point. And if you look at the people, this is, the streetcar era, although already there are a few cars, you notice, pedestrians appear pretty relaxed. And streets historically were social places where people would stop to talk, children would play in the streets, merchants would sell things from carts. But all that changed in the early part of the last century around this time. And it happened really quickly. Here's a photo of Carnegie Avenue in 1946. This remains one of the most dangerous streets in the city. It's really terrifying to walk or bike down today. But as you can see, this is 16 years later. All that pedestrian activity has been supplanted, and cars really dominate the right of way to the exclusion of people, pretty much. So the sort of mythology about this in American mindset is that there was this American love affair with the automobile, and that this was this really frictionless sort of adoption. But that's not true. There's an author out of the University of Virginia named Peter Norton that wrote a really interesting book about this that digs into some of the history. And actually, when cars first started appearing in cities in a big way in this time period, the late 30s, early 40s, people were really furious. There started to be deaths, lots and lots of deaths. Actually, they make our death rate right now, which is still bad by international standards look good. There would be thousands of children getting killed in the streets of places like Cleveland and Philadelphia and St. Louis, just historic cities that at that point hadn't been hollowed out the way they are now and filled with parking lots and that kind of thing. So there was actually a pretty large political fight about this, and the anti-car group was kind of led by mothers, a lot of them who had lost children in cities. They rallied in different cities across the United States for regulations that would sort of limit the freedom of drivers. One of the most important battles took place in Cincinnati, where a group called the National Safety Council had proposed speed governors in cars. I believe it was limiting them to 25 miles an hour in the city. Now, opposed to the mothers, there was this group Peter Norton calls Motordom, and that included auto interests, basically car salesmen, hobbyists, auto clubs, people who were involved in the selling of fuel. And they started this campaign to introduce the concept of jaywalking, which until this time did not exist at all. So they introduced this concept of jaywalking. And at the time, in that period, the term jay was a sort of a derogatory slang term. And like, I think the equivalent today would be like calling someone a hillbilly or a hick. So they introduced this concept of jaywalking, and here's an example of a flyer that was handed out. They would have Boy Scouts and that kind of thing hand out these flyers. It was like a propaganda campaign. This is from Cincinnati in 1952, and I mean, you can read and see what it says. The idea was to introduce this notion that the space for pedestrians was this narrow area at intersections, and then only then were pedestrians allowed to be there when basically there was no traffic, when the lights allowed. So that obviously is just part of a very core way we conceptualize this issue and where pedestrians belong today. And going back to my earlier slide, we now have more than 6,000 pedestrian deaths a year. Still, there's this reflex always to blame the victim. Why were they in the street in the first place? They don't belong there. So pedestrians have become very marginalized, and here's just an illustration that I think helps dramatize, sort of the issue for people. But like I mentioned, it hasn't been very explored in the United States. It's not, a social issue that's really been on people's radar too much. And I think part of the reason for that, just moving along, is most of us, I include myself in this category, that's, a little bit privileged, middle class or above, even most poorer folks in the United States that have access to a car, aren't doing much walking. Especially, we might be walking in little sweet spots of cities like Ohio City, or if you're in Boston, you're in a gentrifying area of Boston. Maybe you're a higher income person and you do some walking because the environment is very, very friendly for that. But for a lot of us in a more privileged position, we're just never put in this position that this mother is in this picture. And this is what the environment is like for pedestrians in a lot of the United States and transit riders. So it's part of the issue, I think, and one of the themes in the book, as the subtitle references, is this issue is a lot about inequality. And the people who are getting killed walking in the United States often have overlapping marginalized identities. Black men are like 2.5 times as likely as white men to get killed while walking. Latino men are at increased risk. Older folks of all races have increased risk of being killed while walking. Certain other categories, people with disabilities, that kind of thing. So I just want to walk through some of the characters from my book and sort of explain their stories. And I think it will help kind of dramatize the issue. And I hope for attorneys, it will be thought-provoking and get people to think about the way this intersects with our laws and the way we treat people in the criminal justice system who wind up in this situation. So this first character is a woman named Raquel Nelson, and she was a single mother. She lived in suburban Atlanta, In 2010, this is a little bit of an old case, but in 2010, she was trying to cross the street near her home. She lives in Cobb County, which is a northern suburban area of Atlanta. And she had 3 children. She was 29 years old, and this is her son, AJ Newman, that's also pictured. The family had been out to eat, and in Cobb County in northern Atlanta, there's not very good transit service. They relied on the bus. And on the way home from dinner, they went out to eat. They're returning from dinner. She's got her 3 kids. It's late at night. She's trying to cross this road, which I'll show in the next slide. This is a road outside of where she lived. She lives in an apartment building or an apartment complex that would have been sort of affordable, but is in a very suburban type environment. So this was the road. It's called Austell Road. That was between her bus stop and where she lived with her kids. And they're trying to cross this at night. And there was a driver, her son AJ, who was 4, he apparently got loose from her grasp while they were trying to cross the street and was hit by a driver. The driver had 2 previous hit and run convictions and apparently was partially blind in one eye. But anyway, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison for that on a plea agreement. But this case ended up grabbing national attention, even though this is a kind of situation that happens all the time across the United States, and usually there may be a news article about it that would note, whether traffic was affected by it, but it wouldn't be a big deal. But in this case, the Cobb County prosecutor made the decision to try Raquel Nelson herself. She was charged and eventually convicted of vehicular homicide in this case where her son was killed, because under the idea that she was jaywalking at the time of this incident. And she and her daughter were actually also injured in this crash. But nevertheless, she was convicted by an all-white jury. It was in 2011 of vehicular homicide involving the death of her son. And she faced, the penalty for that was actually potentially longer than the driver who was responsible, who did 6 months. So just zooming out a little bit, because earlier I showed this chart, okay, and it talks about why pedestrian deaths in the United States, or it shows how pedestrian deaths are rising. One of the reasons I think that that's happening is because of the suburbanization of poverty in the United States. This is a national trend, but I think, and everyone's sort of heard, I think most people who are fairly well-read have heard about suburbanization poverty, but I think if you look at these maps, it's just really dramatic. And I don't think we realize what a big demographic shift this has been. So this shows Atlanta, and the green areas are areas of concentrations of Black people, and orange shows concentrations, basically segregation where white people are living. So she's up in Marietta right here, is where this took place. So in 1990, you can see pretty stark racial segregation in metro Atlanta. But by 2010, this is 20 years later, it's broken down quite a bit. Actually, the two northern counties in Atlanta, Cobb and Gwinnett County, they were founded by segregationists that back in the 1960s that were like fleeing Atlanta, were fleeing desegregation orders at the public schools. And now actually both of them are majority minority counties. So there's been a huge demographic shift in Atlanta, and that is something that's taking place across the country. I have charts for Cleveland too, but we see the same kind of pattern in Cleveland, although it's not quite as stark because we don't have the same kind of population growth as Atlanta. But as we have more people, so we have more racial integration happening in suburban areas now. We also have more economic integration. We have more lower income folks up in the suburbs, and these suburbs were not designed for people who walk, like this Austell Road this Austell Road where she was hit. It was never designed to be suitable for pedestrians, but now there's lower income people out there that are having to contend with those conditions. So that's part of the problem. And if you look actually at where pedestrian deaths are concentrated, it's not just, it has to do with geography, as in where people are within a metro region, like I was talking about suburban versus urban, but also there's certain areas of the country where there's a real concentration of pedestrian deaths. And this shows a chart from Smart Growth America. The places that are most dangerous to pedestrians are in the South, in the Southeast. All of these areas, Texas, Florida in particular is a really hot spot for pedestrian deaths. These are all places that developed later than like a Cleveland or a Philadelphia. These are places where there wasn't much settlement before sort of the advent of air conditioning. So all these places, their streets, their cities were built sort of during the auto era, past the picture I showed in 1946, past this when engineers were all geared up at building the interstate highway system and designing streets to sort of accommodate this. So that's why we see this sort of geographic inequality and where this is occurring as well. So just to circle back to Raquel Nelson, she actually, although she was convicted, the judge in the case offered her the opportunity for a retrial. And she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court. It was like a 3-year legal battle for her. Actually, the Supreme Court in Georgia refused to hear the case, and they remanded it to the lower court. I hope I'm using the right terminology because I'm not an attorney. But eventually, the charges, the vehicular manslaughter or vehicular homicide charge was dropped, and she was ordered to pay a $200 fine for jaywalking in the case. So after 3 years and losing her son, she went through a 3-year legal battle and walked away with a $200 fine. So that's just a case where I think it's obvious that it intersects with racism, and this issue does in a lot of different ways. The National NAACP was actually involved in this case, and people were pretty outraged about it. Sort of an example of overzealous prosecution, and I know that's a hot topic in the news right now. But later in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about a white mother who's in a similar situation, and it's interesting how differently she's sort of treated by the government. This next case, though, I'm going to talk about. It starts off a little bit similar. This is a story about a boy, Neely Saxon Jr. He was just under 2. He was playing with some friends in the street. They lived in Broward County, Florida, in front of his grandmother's house. And actually, it wasn't a very busy street. It was like the kind of street where children would sometimes play. There were speed bumps and everything. But in 2017, he was hit by a car. This is a case that really caught my attention because the driver in the case didn't stop. She didn't stop until after hitting him, until she had driven several hundred feet and stopped at a stop sign. At that point, this is a sad story. A bunch of onlookers grabbed her out of the car and basically beat her up. So this was something, it got a little more news attention than a normal pedestrian crash as well. He was killed in the case. And so there was some debate. Here's his mother. She was heartbroken. There was some debate among the people who observed it about whether the woman who hit him, she was driving a 2007 Hyundai Santa Fe, whether she knew she had hit him or not, whether it was a hit and run, which is very common in pedestrian deaths, or whether she just wasn't aware. Well, that's a lot of times what drivers will claim. But police in this case took the side of the driver. Let's just look at, I want to talk about a little bit, shift gears and talk a little bit about cars now, because certain things that are happening in the auto industry are really contributing to the problem and are discussed a lot in the book. So this is a Honda Santa Fe from the year 2007. And this is just like a pretty normal car now. This is, a crossover SUV. But the police in the case said her bumper was so high, she wouldn't have been able to see the boy. And the woman who hit him, she was never charged in the case, even with a traffic violation. They were just like, well, her front bumper's high, she can't see him, and that's it. So a lot of times there isn't a very sophisticated investigation of routine crashes. I mean, this is a fatality. even in those cases by police, it's a big problem for victims. So anyway, it turns out vehicle styles have a big impact on whether or not people who are hit by cars survive. And this is something we're starting to better understand, and is a big explanation for why we've seen this big increase in pedestrian deaths in the United States, because Americans don't drive sedans anymore. After the last recession in about 2012, 2013, oh, here it is, 2014, SUV sales surpassed sedans in the United States, and that has not slowed down at all. I just saw 77% of the new vehicles sold last year were either SUVs, either crossovers or full size, and pickup trucks. So that's just really bad news for pedestrians for a lot of reasons. Like if you look at, this is just a picture I took in Cleveland, but I just want, I think it does a good job of showing how much bigger cars have gotten. So this is, you know, it's a crossover compared to a sedan. And the big three now, I know a lot of people have heard, are pretty much phasing out. They're not even producing regular vehicles anymore. They only want to sell crossovers, which are much more profitable for them. But if you look at these two vehicles, I just want you to notice how much bigger the one is than the other. And they have identical seating capacity. So Americans are trading this car on the right for this car on the left. And they're bigger and they're heavier. And another thing that's critical is they hit pedestrians higher on the body. So if you're hit by a sedan, you might get hit in the legs, right? But if you're hit by an SUV, and this is a crossover, so it's not as bad as some of these vehicles, maybe you're getting hit in the hips, maybe you're getting hit in the stomach, maybe if it's big enough, you're getting hit in the chest. And that's much more dangerous for obvious reasons. Some research has shown in recent years that SUVs are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to kill pedestrians when they hit them than a sedan. And it's worse for children. They're about 4 times as likely to be killed. So I just to a little bit dramatize the issue. This is a picture of my son when he's 4 years old, and this is a lifted Ford F-250. And these kind of pickups, like a Chevy Silverado now is the #1 selling vehicle in the United States. The front ends have become extremely aggressive in recent years. They have enormous frontal blind zones. Here's a photo. It was produced by this organization called kidsincars.org, and they try to reduce car deaths that happen outside of normal traffic situations, like hot car deaths. They work on that kind of thing. But there's basically enough room in the frontal blind zone of, this is, I believe, an SUV. There was enough room to put, this was 17 children, and they could have fit actually quite a few more, but they just couldn't get enough parents to sign off on doing this experiment. But just to show, like, all of these kids would be totally invisible to the driver of this SUV. So that's a big liability. And going back to this crossover in the Neely Saxon Jr. case, 2 children around his age, around 2, are very vulnerable to this kind of crash, not just from front blind zones, but also from rear blind zones. You would be shocked how often people back over their own children in their own driveways in the United States. And it's happening more and more as cars get bigger. In the United States, actually about 50 children a week are backed over in their own driveways in the United States. It's really, really horrifying. So there's a little bit of good news on this front, in that now we require backup cameras in cars, and that should reduce these back over deaths. But these rarer front over deaths, like the one that killed Neely Saxon Jr., are on the rise as cars have gotten bigger. So moving on, I want to talk about a few more characters from my book. And these are, this is Amy Tamlao, pictured on the right, similar type of story. This is her daughter, Allison, who's pictured there, was killed by the driver of an SUV in Queens in 2013. She was in a crosswalk at the time she was killed. She was holding her grandmother's hand. I've seen the video, it's really horrifying. But they became big advocates in New York City. They teamed up with this woman here. Her name is Amy Cohen, and she's a character in my book. The same year, her son, who was 12, was killed by a driver in Park Slope, Brooklyn. So these two women, usually in the United States, when people lose loved ones to traffic crashes, it's so common. And the attitude has sort of been like, well, it's an act of God, there's nothing we can do about this. But the truth is that a lot of, as I've been discussing, there's a lot of decisions at different levels of government that sort of determine how many people are going to be killed this way. And these two are a really rare case in being in New York that they got active, and they formed a group called Families for Safe Street. There's Amy Cohen at a press conference. She's holding a picture of her son Sammy, who was killed. And these families in New York, they formed together. They started this group, and in 2014 they started, this is the year after their children were killed, they started traveling to Albany. And that year the mayor of New York committed to a Vision Zero policy, which is, for people that aren't aware, Vision Zero is a movement that started out of Sweden, and the idea is to end traffic deaths entirely is the goal. So a number of cities across the United States now have that as their stated goal. They're not accepting, the attitude is no longer to accept traffic deaths as sort of a matter of course or the cost of doing business. The new idea behind Vision Zero is no traffic death is acceptable, and it's part of the responsibility of the street designers to prevent that from occurring. So right away they started having successes. This group, Amy Cohen and her family, they would go, just weeks after her son was killed, they would go to city council meetings and give tearful testimony about their son. One of the things they demanded was a lower speed limit for New York. At the time, the default speed limit for New York, unless streets were specially signed, was 30 miles per hour. And they were able to win, and this took state level approval, they were able to win a reduction to 25 miles per hour. And since then, their focus has been a lot on getting speed cameras installed. In New York, they have a speed cameras program, and those are limited to school zones. But in they had a big battle in 2018, a big political battle. So here's another character, and this is sort of a bad guy in my story. His name is Marty Golden, and he was a state senator in New York. In 2018, they had been twice to Albany, and they won approval for this speed camera legislation. And then they went back and they won approval to expand it. I believe now it's in about 1,700 school zones in New York. So it's still just a fraction of the school zones in New York. But studies have shown it reduces speeding significantly, and it reduces injury crashes significantly as well. So they consider it a big success in New York. But the whole program was threatened in 2018 by this guy named Marty Golden, who represents a more suburban part of Brooklyn, or he did represent a more suburban part of Brooklyn. I'm sort of spoiling it. But he wanted to let the program expire, and he's sort of like the perfect villain for this story, because he had about 8 of these tickets. He was like a serial offender of this rule. He was speeding through school zones and getting caught. And not just that, but he had actually been involved with a wreck. He was driving a car where someone was killed. So he is like a dangerous driver. And he and another Republican had proposed just letting the speed camera bill expire. So this was a huge battle, and I think it's kind of inspiring. These grieving mothers sort of went to work trying to get this approved, trying to save the school, the speeding camera legislation in New York. And this actually shows a picture of Amy Tamlao, who was in the first picture. Remember, her daughter Allison was killed. She and some folks from Transportation Alternatives, which is a group that supports better biking, walking, and transit in New York, they held a protest. They were in the street in front of Marty Golden's office in 2018. They held a banner that said, "Children are going to die." And they were arrested for blocking the street. They sort of knew they would be arrested. And I talked to Amy, and she's interviewed in the book, and she said, "I've never been arrested. I was really nervous, but I just felt like I had to do this." These women are really motivated to try and save other mothers from having to go through what they went through. So I still thought it was shocking that the NYPD went through with it and arrested this mom. Meanwhile, Amy Cohen, who I mentioned earlier, she held a round-the-clock vigil in front of Senator Golden's office. There's a picture of her son again. And one of the quotes here I think is really powerful. She says, "Our children have been killed. We have nothing left to lose." So this has sort of a happy, I know this is heavy stuff, but this story has a happy ending. They eventually, the women were successful. This group was successful, and advocates, this Governor Cuomo in New York issued an executive order to allow the speed camera legislation to be renewed in time for the school year that year. So they were successful. And then 2 months later, Marty Golden lost his reelection campaign to a state senator who's the big safe streets advocate in New York. So New York is sort of way ahead of a lot of the country in looking at these issues and tackling them and trying to think about how we can address sort of the core safety issues. But they're having a lot of success, and a lot of other cities are looking to them now. Only about 50% of people who live in New York City even have a car in the household. So there were it's a little bit of a different political battle than it is in like a Cleveland, but the success they've had there has inspired a lot of other cities. In 2018, the year this happened, their number of traffic deaths in New York City was the lowest it had been in 100 years, basically since cars were introduced, since those early photos I showed back to the streetcar days. That's how much lower they've gotten. It has reversed a little bit in recent years, but still, they're one of the big success stories, and a lot of other cities are looking to them. So that's just sort of 3 stories from the book that I think give a little sense of what's going on around the issue and a new way to think about it. And with that, I just a little plug for my book. The publisher's offering, if anyone who tuned in wants to purchase it, there's a 20% discount if you use my last name, Schmitt. And I think we're gonna do a few questions now.
Thank you, Angie. That was a tremendous presentation. I appreciate your getting into some of the stories that help drive some of the legislation and some of the change. I did note that I want to comment and ask your thoughts on one of the slides you had. In one of the earlier pictures you had, there was a group of perhaps a family that was waiting on a bus stop on a very long road. Yeah,
Right.
that's the one. And I wonder if you can add about the infrastructure, the deficiencies there that might contribute to that. I mean, I noticed there's no crosswalk. I'm not sure there's a bench there for them. It's just a sign at the road. It's not really shelter, so I'm not sure anybody would really appreciate that as a bus stop if they were driving along. To what degree is the infrastructure part of that problem?
Yeah, it's a huge part of the problem. I would say, like, I come from a planning background, but infrastructure is probably the number one thing. And like I said, and I was trying to use this to talk a little bit about inequality in the United States. One of my big takeaways from the book is throughout the United States, we have all these streets where we have pieces missing. Like we don't do that to drivers. Like we don't have highway segments where there are just essential pieces of safety infrastructure missing. When we build a highway, we make sure people have everything they need to get there safely and quickly, for the most part. But that's not true at all for pedestrians and on streets like this, especially in lower income areas, especially in places like Florida, where it's only the more marginalized people that are walking. And this puts people at risk. All these things, not having sidewalks is a huge risk factor. Actually, bus stops, I think, are underrated as a problem, but not having bus shelter is a big problem for people. And in addition to safety, here there's not even any curbs, so any car who veer off the road could just hurt and kill this family. I think, again, those of us that are really privileged are just never put in this situation. And if we were, we would be demanding a solution, but we just aren't, so we're not very sympathetic.
Angie, we have a couple of questions in our Q&A. The first one is, to what degree has cell phone use contributed to the increase in pedestrian deaths?
Yeah, this is everyone's first question. This is my first question I got last time I gave this. This is everyone's top theory about why pedestrian deaths are climbing. Okay, to answer that, we don't know for sure, because like I mentioned, usually there aren't very thorough crash investigations, even in fatalities, right? The police, it hasn't been a focus, right, for police departments in the United States. In some other places like New York City, they've beefed up crash investigations. London, where they take Vision Zero really seriously, they've beefed up crash investigations significantly. In Sweden, they do very serious crash investigations. We don't do that here. And people don't admit it, you know, if they're distracted, if you crash into something. So, I mean, sometimes they are able to use records and everything. And I think it's used a lot in civil cases, but we really don't know for sure. But I can say a couple things. We do know people who have smartphones use them when they're driving all the time. Like almost everyone who has a smartphone uses their smartphone according to some of the best data on almost every car trip they take. And they're distracted by it for a scary amount of the time they're driving. And we know that's very dangerous. Like we know it's like being drunk. It's very similar to being drunk, if not worse. It increases your chances of crashing as much as 24 times to be in the period following that level of distraction. Okay, but that being said, we have seen pedestrian deaths decline in a lot of comparable nations, like the UK, in Europe as a whole, and in Canada. Pedestrian deaths have declined over this same period. So there's no like ironclad rule that once you introduce smartphones, pedestrian deaths increase. That's been the case in the United States, and there probably is a relationship, but it's not like that's the rule and that's what always happens, I guess is what I would say.
Okay, we have a second question. What are your thoughts on how we can improve streets in suburban areas of our county, like Solon, Chagrin, Hunting Valley, etc., where sidewalks aren't present at all and there is strong opposition to trails?
It's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard. But so actually, I just launched a consultancy, and I want to try to do this. Like, I want to try to implement solutions to this. And one thing I would say is, so in the planning industry, a lot of times, like what's proposed in suburban areas is called a road diet, where they take, like, let's say there's a 4-lane street, they change it, convert it into a 3-lane street with 2 bike lanes. And that is a thing that really improves safety, not just for drivers, but for pedestrians. But there's actually a lot that can be done that I think that might not have the effect of upsetting drivers at all. Like, doesn't really rock the boat, mess with the status quo where drivers are sort of the core constituency we're trying to cater to. Like, one thing they did in New York is they changed the timing at the traffic lights. So like in Chagrin, in Solon, maybe you have to wait a minute and a half for a walk signal, and then it's 8 seconds and you have to sprint. And if you're an elderly person or a person who uses a mobility device, it puts you in a dangerous position. So that's one thing I think we should look at again. There's also tools like at this road here, just for example, if it had a grassy median, sometimes they're called pedestrian refuge islands, that increases safety quite a bit. So different tools like that. And that area here in the middle, now it would be a little bit pricey to add that, but that, I don't think any driver no one's going to be upset about this unused asphalt being converted to grass. And that's the kind of thing that would help people. So there's different tools like that. Another thing to look for actually is a lot of places, and especially lower income neighborhoods, may not have adequate streetlights. Like 75% of pedestrian deaths occur at night, so lighting is a huge factor. So that's another thing where it doesn't necessarily even have to turn into a war on cars thing. It's like, is the basic infrastructure in place or not? And then finding the funding for that is another challenge, or can be a challenge as well, because our priorities have been, again, like giant highway flyovers, and not making sure like the woman in this position or this bus stop is ADA accessible, for example.
Angie, if I can interject here with a question as well, and that is that your lessons from New York talked about the state adopting reductions in speed limits and things like that. Is that the number one change that might be very impactful here, is reducing speed limits in, for instance, the city of Cleveland? And then related to that, is there a relationship between the car speed and the potential for injury or death?
Yes. So like speed, there's this old saying that speed kills, and everyone is just, nobody takes that seriously anymore, but it's really true. If you start reading about like the physics of a car crash, even if you're a driver, it's really scary and horrifying. And there's a formula that basically determines the amount of force that's released in a collision, but it's sort of exponential. So like a 10 mile per hour increase in speed might increase your chances of dying for you twice. It could double your chances of dying. So it's very sensitive to speed. And that's why they lowered the speed limit in New York, where there's so many pedestrians. Other cities have done that. Portland's default speed limit now is 20 miles per hour. They do 20 miles per hour speed zones throughout Europe. It's huge in the UK. And people, I can imagine a lot of grumbling about that here, because our culture just isn't, it's all about speed. But it's very popular actually with neighborhoods, because if you think about like what kind of conditions you'd want in your own neighborhood, the things that would be sort of ideal for, children having sort of freedom to roam, you can walk and bike safely, is around that speed. And that 20 miles per hour is the speed where almost all pedestrians who are hit by a car survive. But if they're hit by a car going 40 miles per hour, it's exactly the opposite. They're more likely to die than survive.
I saw a street sign, kind of a handmade street sign that looked like a family had just put it together themselves, that said 20 is plenty. So yeah, maybe there's room for a campaign on something like that.
Yeah. I think it takes a lot of work to like shift the culture a little bit, because people, our culture is just we haven't been geared towards safety. There isn't really, and if you look at what's happening with Corona a little bit now, I think it's a little bit similar in a lot of ways, where it's just like, well, we've got to reopen restaurants. Those people need to work. And these other nations seem to be handling it better, seem to have a little bit less tolerance for risk and unnecessary deaths. So I think there's a lot of work to be done culturally. But yeah, I mean, it would pay, like, these crashes are expensive. Every single person that's killed walking, they value, the economists will do like this value of life thing and say it's, a couple $1 million is what it costs us when a person dies. I mean, it's very expensive. The level of injuries and the cost of traffic crashes in the United States, it's like $700 billion a year. So we're not, and we're trading injuries and deaths for like seconds of time savings in a lot of cases, or none, because in urban areas, mostly what determines how fast our journey is traffic crashes in the United States. Mostly what determines the length of or the time it takes us to travel is how long we're stopped, not how fast we're traveling. In urban conditions, it's like you can speed up to 35. If you get stopped at a traffic light, any whatever minute or seconds you shaved off your trip is, up in smoke. So all that racing around really isn't even saving us very much time, and it causes a lot of problems. I think someone had a question or chimed in. I sorry, I couldn't hear what they were saying.
Guess not.
Angie, while we're pulling up some of the other questions, perhaps you can comment on some of the other things that might be done. You talked about reducing speed, obviously. You talked about perhaps creating traffic islands for people or for the elderly who might have difficulty crossing a street. What are some of the other things you might look for to try and improve or even the lighting on the streets? I thought that was significant because I didn't see many street lights in some of your photos. Are there some other things that you would be recommending?
Yeah, so in New York, they did this thing called leading pedestrian intervals, which is where signals are timed so that the walker gets to start their walk signal before cars are turning left and right. And that was shown to be really, really effective. Like immediately, crashes are dropping about 45%. So that idea of a leading pedestrian interval, changing the traffic signal timing again, and that can be done relatively inexpensively. In New York, it was costing about $1,200. They're also doing this thing they call it hardening. I don't have a good diagram. It's the kind of thing it would be better to have a diagram of, but basically they put like a sign or a post in the middle of the intersection, sort of out past the crosswalk. And it forces drivers making left turns to make a sharp, slow left turn because they have to travel around this object that's in the intersection instead of a fast, sort of sloping left turn. And left turns are very dangerous. A lot of pedestrians are killed at left turns, and actually they're very dangerous for drivers too. It's just sort of a complicated driving move. So thinking about how you can make those left turns a little more cautious is another smart way to do it, and something they've had success with in New York.
I was going to ask you, so one of our colleagues who couldn't join today, we had another program, totally different topic at noon today, was about your feelings on the scooters, the motorized scooters, because they just brought them back downtown, which I was actually kind of surprised about, just touching, like, different people touching them. But, she was saying how they go so fast and sometimes they sneak up on you. So if you had any insight on the individual scooters.
Yeah, I'm supportive, I think like giving people more alternatives to driving, like, I mean, it's funny because it's like, you look at like this slide. I don't know if you guys can still see these. I mean, like, this is like normal vehicle for people to drive anywhere. Like you can drive this into Midtown Manhattan, right? And it's like all the worrying we've done about scooters and meanwhile cars have just been getting more and more dangerous, and are so I don't know, it's funny just like certain things we've got accustomed to, and then when something new comes along, we tend to be very skeptical, I guess, and not as much skeptical about things that are sort of already part of the landscape. But I don't think that they're going to have a huge impact on like the way people travel in cities. I think some people kind of have fun with them, and I think that's good. But I don't know. I don't think they'll have a big factor on any of this.
Thank you. There are no more questions in the queue and or the chat. So Kevin, do you have any more questions before we start to wrap it up?
Well, I do, and I thank you for this new book. I'll look forward to it. But the idea, is it primarily written, do you think you're trying to educate the public? Or are you aiming for legislators and policymakers and things like that? And is there some sort of a way of presenting to policymakers with this idea in your research?
Yeah, I would love it if people in important positions would take it and run with it and try, because a lot of these problems are political, right? I think like with this problem, I think there's a lot of different problems that are sort of competing for our attention, especially right now, right? Like we have some serious problems right now. This probably isn't gonna, take first place at the moment, but they're sort of competing for our attention, right? And I think, like, traffic safety is not always the most important problem, but it's a more important problem than it sort of gets credit for. Like, if we took traffic safety a little bit more seriously in the United States, we could save a lot of lives. Like, we could reduce a lot of suffering. And I think this problem is similar. Like, if it was just recognized as more of a problem and there was a little more attention to it, I think they would go a long way. So whether it's like normal readers who just get excited about it and are maybe active in their community, or obviously a policymaker that has a lot of room, I think more money would help. If communities like Solon and Chagrin, which someone brought up, had a lot of money at their disposal to add things like pedestrian safety islands and to retime their signals instead of having a lot of money for highway flyovers, that would go a long way. So I think there needs to be like a sort of a shift in the way we think about this kind of thing. And that's why I tried to go into a little bit of the historical background. I think things are shifting. Especially in some other cities, and some other cities, Cleveland, probably sort of in the middle, but are playing catch up in a way with some of the cities that are sort of leading the charge.
Yeah. As related, Angie, if I can raise another point, and that is that increasingly, we talk a lot about, for instance, here in the city of Cleveland, about the quality of life. We're trying to attract people to help build up the city and reverse some of the population losses that have occurred. Do you think traffic safety gets enough credit as being part of the quality of life that we're talking about? I mean, neighborhood safety, this idea of 25 or 20 miles per hour, and kids kind of reclaiming, being able to claim part of that street or things like that. Do you believe that's a part of the quality of life agenda?
Yeah, that's the way it's been framed a lot. And I do think, yeah, there's a lot to it. Like, so much of this ties back to suburbanization, and who benefited from suburbanization and who was negatively impacted by suburbanization. A lot of that goes back to policy. But I do think we have to be careful about trying to make sure this isn't just like access to safe streets isn't like a luxury item that only rich people can afford, that it should be provided to everyone, regardless of income and that type of thing. And I think that's one of the ways the industry, like I said, I come from a planning background. I think that's one of the ways the industry has kind of failed on this, is like, in some cases now we're doing an okay job of providing walkable environments, but mostly in like a few wealthier areas or gentrifying areas, and not in a lot of cases in the lower income neighborhoods where people are most dependent on walking and where they would do the most good.
In both of your examples that you had, I think they were both at night, if I'm not mistaken. What about daytime? And is this like kids walking to school? Is this an issue for them?
Yes, yeah. Actually, there was some really good reporting by the Akron Beacon Journal. It's a little bit dated now. I think it's at least 5 years old. And I cannot recall the exact numbers, but they found that, I believe it was urban school children in Ohio. So I think they were looking at the 8 big city school districts in the state of Ohio. Children were being hit walking to school at, I believe, 2 or 3 times the rate of suburban kids. And actually, my son goes to a Cleveland public school. It's called Waverly. And a student at his school was hit this year while she was waiting for the bus. And it was a hit and run. And so the news was out 3 times at the school. I just think like how traumatic that would be. If you're a kid trying to go to 2nd grade and you're hit by a car and now you have a broken leg and have to deal with that, and your family has to deal with whatever comes along with that. I mean, there's just the smaller, like the cases I highlighted are really dramatic, but I think if we like underappreciate like the amount of trauma that comes out of just car crashes, because they're so everyday to us, we're just so inured to it.
Oh, very good. Perhaps we should be drawing towards a close. If there are no questions from the audience and the like, I just want to highlight, if I can, one last item that we've been with Angie Schmitt, author and researcher, who's got a new book coming out called Right of Way, and we'll look for it in stores, Amazon, and all the traditional places. Thank you very much for that. I do want to, I hope you can, if you've enjoyed this forum, please follow the City Club on Facebook so you can have notices and things like that of upcoming things. As mentioned, we'll be coming back next week, next Tuesday, with a forum at noon on August 11th, focusing on HB6, last year's energy bill, that's now generated interest in repeal or reform. And, in wake of the state's historic bribery scandal. And we're going to have some state experts on energy policy here to talk about things, and it's a discussion that I'm sure you won't want to miss. So come back next Tuesday for another show. We've been here with Angie Schmitt this afternoon. Thank you very much, Angie, for your time. We really look forward to the book and think you're going to be contributing a great deal to some important public policy discussions here in Ohio and hopefully across the country.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. That sounds so interesting next week too. I'm excited about that. So, all right, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Angie.
Thank you.